this style of argument is obviously a little bit difficult to accept because, well, first of all, Durkheim might not have seen or found all existing explanations, and there might be even more explanations around. And second, um, even if all of the existing explanations fail, it does not necessarily imply that Durkheim's explanation is the best explanation around. So the best explanation may not have been found. In any case, this is Durkheim's style of argument that you find in many of his works, and he rules out, first of all, then the individual pursuit of happiness or other individual pursuits, such as Kant's ennui, so in a way, boredom. So happiness, so the strive for happiness pushes people into different positions in the division of labor, or people just get individually bored by what they do and strive to get more excited in new kind of works. And this individual explanation, according to economists or Comte, then would push the division of labor. And Durkheim argues against this by basically saying that well, the pursuit of happiness has always been relatively constant, and this is difficult. It is difficult to explain this explosion in the division of labor, given that there's this constancy in the pursuit of happiness. Then Durkheim also just points out to the fact that modern societies are not necessarily the most happy societies. So why would they have put up the division of labor in the first place? So all in all, does not seem to be the main motive behind the division of labor. So here is then Durkheim's own main explanation, and I quote here the division. The division of labor varies in direct proportion to the volume and density of societies, and if it progresses in a continuous manner in the course of social development, it is because societies become regularly more dense and generally more voluminous. End of quote. So the main variables for Durkheim that explain the division of labor then is simply population growth and a higher density of the population. Let's say both a material, but also what he calls a moral density. By this he means, in modern terms, just the frequency of interactions, frequency of exchanges. Durkheim thinks about the growing cities of his time, urbanization, is exploding at the end of the 19th century, and more people are basically pressured by competition for jobs into new positions. So it is important to mention that Durkheim's explanation here is a structural explanation. So he focuses on non-individual, so structural causes, and these structural causes are also, let's say, pressuring the individual. So it's much more of a pushing kind of explanation than a pull explanation that economists would forward. So it is really upside down in that sense. So as I mentioned earlier, there is something like the non-contractual precondition also of contracts, or in other terms, the organic solidarity that characterized segmented societies in Durkheim never really ceases to exist. There's always a basic segment, according to Durkheim, of solidarity in the family, for instance, but also among members of the same profession. And that basic similarity is always of mechanic solidarity is always necessary then for then even modern societies to exist. So you always need solidarity on the basis of similarity, even in very differentiated societies. Otherwise, they break down. Durkheim did not leave it there. So this was the main thrust then of the division of labor in the first edition. When Durkheim revised then this first edition, he was much more skeptical about his earlier writings. Namely, he was skeptical as to whether the division of labor and the interdependency created by this organic solidarity would be sufficient to fulfill this new role of solidarity. In other terms, if you just depend on your suppliers or your clients in terms of solidarity, it might not prevent certain disintegrating phenomena from happening. Yeah. And he came to this sort of conclusion by also focusing more on these anomic conditions. So, coming from the Greek term against the order, ainomos. Um, kind of conditions in societies that go against the current order. So he observed, for instance, that a division of labor is not a very, let's say, natural thing. It needs to be properly regulated. And if there's no proper regulation, for instance, in terms of worker protection or sort of any kind of rules in favor of, for instance, minimum salary, then there would be a disintegration actually happening through division of labor, which the first Durkheim considered more as the new tool to create solidarity. There may also be forced division of labor. So in the Smith-Spencer world, who gets what kind of job is left relatively underdetermined. Well, many people just have to accept jobs they might not want, and this mismatch, perhaps also of talent and job, can create also anomic phenomena. One other anomic consequence of the division of labor may be over-specialization. And Durkheim notices this himself, that specializing as a sociologist instead of being a broad moral philosopher can sometimes create sort of negative consequences for him. And yeah, even worse than perhaps for manual workers who do not see any meaning in their jobs. Durkheim also mentions the lack of coordination, right? If people are too over specialized, then there may be a lack of coordination between them. And he also mentions, an aspect that Marx would describe as alienation, that is low productivity because work has been so repetitive. So all kinds of negative aspects linked to the division or over the extreme division of labor. Durkheim also writes in the 1890s, for instance, at a time when there were huge strike movements, not only in the United States, but also in European countries. And he writes at a time when suicides were at an all-time high in France. All anomic phenomena, according to Durkheim. Durkheim also observed that anomic states could arise because individualization was going too far. Yeah? So individuals expecting in a way too much from society and hence becoming unsatisfied and turning against society. This uncontrolled kind of individualization is something that sociologists at the end of the 20th century have come up with again. For Durkheim, this was clearly an anomic state already at the end of the 19th century. So the second preface here, or the preface to the second edition, is new because Durkheim wants to strengthen this intermediate layer in society, so between society and the individual, which is made up of, for instance, professional groups, which Durkheim knows also because he read the sort of classics at the time. He knows them as these medieval corporations that organized around a certain professional identity. So in that sense, they were based on similarity, right? So on mechanic solidarity, while at the same time also being a professionally specialized organization. So also realizing the organic solidarity. And he suggests then to strengthen these corporations who, for instance, were small welfare states also for their members. They cared for the apprentices in a certain profession. They had paupers and widows funds to support members of the profession, and they had a certain vocational ethics, so sort of a proper ethical understanding of how to do business. Um, Durkheim writes against, let's say, the too abstract socialist solution for the problem of anomie, something like state and state socialism. I mean, living in the centralized France already of his time, he did not see a strong state as the answer to the problem of anomie, and he also was against reviving the family as an important unit, and this goes against the grain of the conservative sociologists like Frédéric Leplay, who saw the family, religion, and individual property, house, detached house kind of property as the solution to the crisis of anomie. And Durkheim wants basically to strengthen these intermediate layers of society as a new group, and he doesn't want to go back to the old society of family units as economic units. Yeah, so one clear background against which Durkheim comes up with these new ideas in the second preface is also his study on suicide of the time. And these data are not by Durkheim himself, but I collected them here through various historical publications of these different countries. And on this graph, you see depicted the number of suicide per 100,000 inhabitants. So it's a very rare phenomenon, but it exists throughout all of these different countries since the 19th century to the current day. And what you see here on the graph is let's focus first of all on France here in the three letter abbreviation. You see, at the time of writing, France had looked back on a rise in suicide rates, so almost doubling then at the time when Durkheim then published his empirical book on the suicide, in which he makes use of regional suicide statistics in France at the time. So, looking with hindsight, we can even say that Durkheim wrote at a time when suicides even reached an all-time high, with perhaps here the post-war periods being exceptions. Yeah. So the French suicides were also not the highest amongst this group here of countries, at least. The Finns are here ahead at the end of the 20th century, but you also see that it's not true that Scandinavian countries always had the highest suicide rates. So you see the Finnish suicide rate way below here, for instance. And yeah, so the Swedish suicide rate was also relatively low here in comparison then to the French suicide rate. Yeah. Okay, so this is just to give you a little impression. Overall, there has been a slight decline, at least on average, up to the current day. But at the time of writing in the 19th century, the rise in suicide rates was a phenomenon that Durkheim had already observed, and that he wrote his 1897 book then about.